Hello and welcome to the Emotion at Work podcast, and in particular, welcome to episode 52. Now recently I seem to have got into a bit of a habit of doing guest, no guest, guest, no guest. So after our most recent podcast episode, which is episode 51 with the wonderful Denise Sanderson, we're back to me sharing some thinking then for this episode. And in particular, this episode is about emotion at work in emotional sensitivity. Now, emotional sensitivity is to do with how sensitive we are to particular emotions based on particular triggers. Now, I'm going to get into a bit of detail in terms of how triggers come about and where they come from and stuff like that. But the purpose of today, I guess, is about those occasions where emotion grabs you really easily, or it grabs you in ways that are a bit easier than you'd like, where you look back at it and think, oh, I wish that emotion hadn't grabbed me so quickly. So where we have emotional sensitivity or we have a hot trigger, it tends to be where emotion grabs us easily or it grabs us easier than we'd like. It also tends to be where the emotion grabs hard, or we grab the emotion hard and we grab it harder than we would like. It could also be that we grab hold of it for a long time. We grab it for a long time or longer than we'd like. So when you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking about your emotional sensitivity, or you're thinking about your hot triggers, then those three things might help you. So I'm talking here about things that grab you easily or grab you easier than you'd like, that grab you hard or grab you harder than you'd like, or they grab you for a long time or grab you for longer than you would like. All right. So when we think about emotions then, and if you want to hear more about some of the theories that I'm going to go through now, then I would suggest you go back to listen to episodes 25, 26, 27, because they are all focusing on emotions. So Cliff Lansley on emotional intelligence in 25, Joe Wainwright on emotional exploitation in 26, and James Gross on emotion regulation in 27. And then I edited the best bits of all of those together. So if you're a bit short on time, you might want to go for episode 37, which was a special edition with a focus on emotion. So when we think about emotions then, there's this principle called appraisal theory. And the easiest way I can find to describe it is this idea of there's a radar running. And emotions will happen when something that we think is important to our welfare or the welfare of those that we care about, where that is at stake. So when there's something that's important to our welfare or important to others' welfare or well-being, means that emotion is likely to be around. So if we have this radar that's running, somebody says something happens, something's done, something is said, and it kind of grabs us. And my example of that would be my eldest daughter. I've really, for a long time, for probably the first 3 or 4 years of her life, I struggled with her not doing as I'd asked. So if I asked her to do something once, that was okay. If I asked her to do it twice, that was kind of not all right anymore. And if it was 3 times, then that was enough. And if I had to ask like a 4th time, if she didn't do it after the 3rd time of asking, then that emotion would grab me easily. It would grab me hard, and I'd grab onto it for a long time. And it was because I had this thing in my head that my children will not obey me, but they'll do as they're asked. Maybe it was obey me. My kids will do as they're asked. And so when she didn't, then every time she didn't do as I'd asked, not only was I remembering that occasion where she didn't do as she was asked, I was also remembering every other time she'd not done as she was asked. And it became a real hot trigger for me, something that I would grab easily. As soon as she didn't do what I'd asked, and if I'd asked 3 times, I'd grab it hard, and I'd grab onto it for a long time. So when we start to think about how we manage our hot triggers or how we manage our emotional sensitivity, then part of what we need to do is to work out what those occasions are. And so That's what I'm saying. If they grab us easily, they grab us hard, and we grab them for a long time, then those are things that this podcast in particular is going to be helpful and useful for. So we've got this appraisal theory then. So we've got our radar running that notices things that are important to our welfare. And what tends to make things grab us easier, grab us harder, or grab us longer is about the similarity to experiences that we've had in the past. And that could be had in the past from our own personal experience, or it can be experience we've had in the past from an evolutionary perspective. So I've said on the podcast before that for me, emotions are a mix of nature and nurture. So they're a mix of experiences that we've had in our own lifetime, but also experiences that have been passed on from a genetic perspective, and in that kind of basic emotion theory concept. So if we experience something that when we experienced it for the first time was really intense, and or if we experienced it a lot, and or if we experienced it early in life, and or it's similar to an evolutionary theme, then it's more likely that that thing is going to grab us easily, grab us hard, and we're going to grab hold of it for a long time. So before I move into the podcast any further then, what I want you to do is to take a couple of minutes now and think, what are those things then? What are those things that grab me easily? What are those things that grab me hard? And what are those things that I grab onto for a long time? Because it's going to be useful for you to have those things in mind as we work our way through. Now, I've given you an example from my experiences with my daughter. And so I want you to think about, what is it for you then? So pause the podcast now. Come back in a minute or two with those ideas in mind, and then we'll move into both what's going on and what you can do about it. Okay, welcome back. So with those experiences in mind then, earlier on, before we pause for that break, I talked about how things that can make you emotionally sensitive, or things that can be a hot trigger for you, involve things like intensity, frequency, timing in life, and similarity to the evolutionary theme. So I'm going to want to go into those in a bit more detail. So intensity. So when we experience emotion at a very high intensity, then that will get encoded into our memory in a much stronger way than something, for example, that we felt in a very mild way. So if I think about when I've been embarrassed, or I've made a mistake, or where I was really angry about something, or I was very scared about something, those memories are going to be more vivid, which means those triggers are going to be more for me. They're going to be hotter for me. So it's going to make if something happens that is very similar or the same to that thing, then that's going to be a hotter trigger for me. So you may or may not have heard the story, or watched the video, or listened to a previous episode of the podcast. So if you haven't found it, I'll put a link in the show notes. There's a video of me describing an experience I had that started me on my quest to understand more about emotion, where I swore at a customer. But that making a mistake, and that letting emotions flood out of me in the way that they did that day, has made that a really hot trigger for me. So when I can feel anger building and building and building, then that's something that I know I need to work really hard to regulate. I need to regulate that emotion really carefully, because I am particularly sensitive to it. And emotional sensitivity is something that happens at that appraisal phase of emotion. So emotion regulation, which I talked about with James Gross on episode 27 and in the special edition on episode 37, emotion regulation is what's happening after the emotional sensitivity bit has come in. So my radar's running, it picks up something that's similar to this experience that I've had in the past where I was at like a 9 out of 10 in terms of intensity. And then it will say, this is like that. This situation is like that one. And here's the emotion that you need. And here's the feelings that go with that. And that can be super helpful if I'm in certain circumstances. But in this circumstance, when anger is building and building and building, it's not actually that helpful for me, or it's not that constructive for me. So it's partly to do with the intensity of it, but it's also to do with the frequency of it. So if I go back to my example with my daughter, so I said earlier on, that hot triggers can be hotter because of the intensity at the time and or the frequency of them. So I had this thing that was important to me. I said earlier on that emotions happen because of something that we think is important. So what was important to me was I want to have children that listen to their parents. I want my kids to listen to their parents, or in particular, I want my kids to listen to me. So when that didn't happen, and it didn't happen again and again and again and again and again and again and again, that frequency then made this a hotter trigger for me. Now, Grace was young. She was I guess this started probably between sort of 2 and 4 or maybe 5 years old. She's 14 now. But there was something in my head about, because when she was a baby, then it didn't matter because they can't do what you're asking them to do. But when she then became a toddler and she was getting into 2 and she could communicate, she could listen, she could understand, she could follow instructions, I had this thing in my head of, to be a good dad, my kids will listen to me. So when it didn't happen, then that was causing a discrepancy between what I thought in my head made for a good dad and what was actually happening, and therefore I wasn't a good dad. So it was important to me. Tick. Emotion is something that's important to me. Happened a lot, yes. So the frequency was high. Now, I can look back on it now and look at it and think, wow, Phil, your expectations were just completely unrealistic. That said, the trigger at that time was really hot for me. So when she didn't listen, didn't pay attention, didn't do as I asked, then I would get disproportionately angry. Not because of what she did necessarily or what was happening, but because I was bringing with me, my story of a good parent has children that listens to them, or a good dad has a child that listens to them. And I was bringing with me all of the other times where she'd ignored me or not done as I'd asked or not followed the instruction. So our emotional sensitivity can be heightened, or our hot triggers can be hotter, if it's something we've experienced at a high intensity and or it's something that we've experienced frequently. Now the third component then is the when in life it happened, and the earlier in life it happened. Some research suggests, research by Paul Ekman in particular, suggests that Paul Ekman and Joseph Ledoux, I suppose, technically, but anyway, the earlier in life it happened, the more likely it is for you to be emotionally sensitive to it and or for it to be a hot trigger for you. Now, I'd love to give you an example, but I can't think of one for me. In Paul Ekman's book, Emotions Revealed, he talks about an example of somebody who had a dominant figure, a dominant adult figure in their life, and describes them in terms of some of their characteristics, so their age, their gender, how they look. And what he talks about in his book Emotions Revealed is that if that individual, what that individual that he's describing encountered later in life was where the person that they were interacting with in the workplace was of a similar demographic with similar characteristics or of a similar look, it would bring back those memories that they had when they were young. So it would make that trigger hotter for that reason. So we've got the intensity of the emotion at the time, the frequency that it was experienced, the earlier in life that it occurred, and then we have the similarity to the evolutionary theme, which is the fourth component that can make our emotional sensitivity heightened or make our hot triggers hotter. So if we stick with Paul Ekman and his research, what he discusses are 7 universal emotions, those being happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, surprise, and contempt. And each of those, again, Ekman posits, have a universal trigger. So with happiness, it being something pleasurable. With sadness, it being loss of something we value. For anger, it's obstruction to a goal. For disgust, it's something that we find offensive. For fear, it's a threat of harm. For surprise, it's something that's sudden and unexpected. And then for contempt, it's having a feeling of moral superiority. So the closer those things are that we experience to those evolutionary themes, then the more likely it is that we will have a heightened emotional sensitivity. All those triggers may be hotter for us. So in my example, my goal, be a good dad, be a good parent. Obstruction, child not doing what they've been asked after 3 occasions of being asked. Plus experiencing it a lot. Combine those things together, a hotter trigger for me. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to pause the podcast. So roughly about 10 minutes ago, I asked you to think about the things that grab you easily, grab you hard, and grab you for a long time, or you grab hold of for a long time. Now I'm going to ask you to think about those situations and then think, okay, well, what's happened in my past then where I may have experienced something similar to the evolutionary theme of that particular emotion that I may be experiencing? Or is this something that I experienced early in life? Or is this something that I experience frequently? I should say and/or really. So what's the similarity to the evolutionary theme? And/or did this happen to me earlier in life? And/or did this happen to me frequently? And/or was it intense? And if we can use those 4 different perspectives then to think about these things that grab us easily or easier than we'd like, grab us hard or grab us harder than we'd like, or we grab a hold of for a long time or longer than we'd like, that might help us with understanding what those triggers are. What are those things that we have those hot triggers or that heightened emotional sensitivity to? So pause the podcast then, come back in a couple of minutes when you've done some thinking, and then we'll move on to the next section. All right, welcome back. So when we think about emotional sensitivity and hot triggers, then I said that's early on in the process. So we've got this metaphorical radar running. It notices something that's important to our welfare. It links it back with experiences that we've had in the past. And then we have the appropriate emotional response. And then we tip into emotion regulation. So we then tip into regulating the emotion. And in the previous episode, I've mentioned already on 27 and 37, the 5 families of emotion regulation are explored. But what I haven't really explored in those episodes is the idea of, well, what's the point then? What's the purpose of doing this emotion regulation? Why do we do it? So within the emotion regulation research then, And I'll put some links in the show notes to some really interesting papers I've been reading about it. So they tend to be describing three orientations or three kind of reasons as to, or interests that we may have for why we do emotion regulation. And they are being goal-oriented, being need-oriented, and being person-oriented. So goal, need, and person-oriented. So for goal-oriented then, this splits down into two subsections. So it's on one hand is called a higher order goal, and that's around how we want to be seen or how we want to see ourselves. And so that for me is a big tick around what I was describing earlier with my daughter. So my higher order goal is I want to be a good parent. And I have made being a good parent mean your children listen to you, or my children listen to me anyway. And so when that isn't happening, I was regulating my emotion up in a rather unhelpful, destructive way, I will add. But anyway, I was regulating my emotion up with a view to achieving that goal of having Grace listen to me. So that what's called the lower order goal then is around concrete behavior control. So that's more to do with, rather than the more, I guess, philosophical view of how I want to be seen or how I see myself, this is more about right here, right now, I need to control my behavior. So a good example of that would be you find something funny at an inappropriate time. So it might be you're laughing at a funeral. You are, you're smiling in a redundancy consultation. It's where you are aware that this behaviour would be inappropriate in this context. So you're the regulation then is to regulate that emotion in these examples down to control the behaviour. So both of them, in both cases, there's a goal. One more philosophical, how I want to be seen, how I want other people to see me. Another one, how I know I should be behaving right here, right now. And then we regulate to achieve that goal. Then there's the need-oriented section, which again kind of subdivides into either the avoidance of pain or the avoidance of negative outcomes, or the experience of pleasure or the experience of positive outcomes. So goal-oriented even is either about how I want to see myself, higher order, or how I need to change my behaviour, lower order. Need-oriented then is the avoidance of pain or results we don't want, or the experience of pleasure or results that we do want. So it's what are my needs in that moment. And then there's the final one is the person-oriented emotion regulation. And that's about regulating actions so that it's in harmony with my needs, motives, and my experiences. So goal-oriented, need-oriented, person-oriented. So you might think, all right then, Phil, well, you're talking about hot triggers and emotional sensitivity, and then you've outlined these three perspectives or these three orientations about emotion regulation. How do they link together? Well, so I would also, if these things are present and orientations that we have when we are regulating the emotion, there has got to be aspects of these at play in the appraisal section, because we have to be appraising something to have an awareness of what's going on, to know if this is a goal, if this is in line with how I want to be seen or in line with how I need to be behaving in this context. I am appraising it with a view of avoiding pain or experiencing pleasure, or getting outcomes I want or outcomes I don't want. Avoiding outcomes I don't want and getting outcomes I want. Or I'm appraising it and assessing it with in line with harmony with my needs, motives, and experiences. So if they're there for regulation, if I regulate my emotion because of these goals must be there as part of my appraisal process when my metaphoric radar is scanning. So again, what I want you to think about then is in those experiences that I've written down, in those experiences that I thought about when Phil asked me to pause about 20 minutes ago, what was either the higher or the lower order goals? And it may be that there isn't one and it's one of the other orientations, but go with me for a moment. Thinking about those experiences that you've had, those things that grab you easily or easier than you like, grab you hard or grab you harder than you like, or grab you for a long time or grab you longer than you would like. What about that was goal oriented? Either about how I want to be seen or how I see myself, or about the appropriateness of that behavior in context. What were my needs at that time? What was I trying to avoid? Or what was I trying to experience? Or from a person-oriented perspective, what were my inner needs, my inner motives, or my inner experiences that link to my personality that were driving what I wanted at that time? Or what I wanted or needed at that time? So I've asked you to think about these experiences. Then I've asked you to think about them from intensity, frequency, when in life they occurred, and how similar they were to those evolutionary themes that I outlined earlier. Now I'm asking you to think about, well, what were the goals? What were the needs? Or what were the person-oriented aspects that were at play? And I'm asking you to do all of this reflection because if we can do that well, that will help us manage and regulate the triggers in the future. Anyway, enough of me talking. Let me stop. So pause the podcast, come back to me in a couple of minutes, and then we'll move on to the next phase. And welcome back for the final time. Okay. So one of the things that I haven't talked about yet is individual differences. So we're all different. And what might be a hot trigger for me, or one thing I might have a heightened emotional sensitivity to, might be really different to something that is the case for you. And within, so we have like individual differences in that way. So between people, so what maybe a hot trigger for you may not be a hot trigger for me. Also though, what may be a hot trigger or maybe something that you have a heightened emotional sensitivity to may be different from one situation or context to another. So one of the things that really got me working on my hot triggers was the arrival of my second child. So the arrival of my second daughter, because I found I didn't get as angry when she didn't follow the instructions or she didn't do as I'd asked. And I found that really interesting. So why with one was it not the case with the other? And that was when the awareness came to me of what a hot trigger it was for me and what it was around that, and identifying that pattern, identifying that that was really helpful and useful for me. So the reason I'm asking you to do this reflection is to try and identify what are these patterns, because in our heads we link things together. We as humans are meaning making machines. So we make things mean stuff all the time. And it's the same with emotions then. So something happens, we experience something, we make it mean X, Y, or Z. I say we make it mean because it may mean other things. It may mean X, but it could also mean F or B. It could mean lots of different things. We often make things mean something. And when it comes to emotional sensitivity and or hot triggers, then what we make things mean is really, really important. So in my example, I was making Grace not following instructions mean I was a bad dad. Was I? No. I guess in a way I was, because I was disproportionately angry when she didn't follow my instructions, but then she was 3 years old. 3-year-olds tend not to do that. Unless you make your instructions in a Mary Poppins-esque way. Unless you make your instructions a game, then they might come and play. My point being that what I'm aiming to do through this podcast is to get you to think about what are those times where you're grabbed easily, grabbed hard, or you grab hold of it for a long time. Because if we can think about those, and then we can work out, well, what are the patterns? What are the similarities here? So that we can then start to think about how we manage those triggers going forward. And for that, we then start to tip into the emotion regulation side of things. So I've said that emotional sensitivity is the beginning. It's the beginning of when the emotion occurs. Now, whether that emotion is something that's triggered by something that happens around us, something that we imagine, something that we remember, something that we dream, something that we relive, we then make that thing mean something. And how we then regulate it is important. So by identifying the patterns and the themes, it allows us to steal from episodes 27 and 37, it allows us to do, for example, situation selection. So if I know that these things are hot triggers for me, I can do situation selection. I might say, right, I'm not going to put myself in that situation. I'm not going to ask Grace the same thing 3 times. Because I know when I do, I get angry about that fact that she doesn't do it. So what can I do differently? How can I not put myself in that situation? Or I can do situation modification, where I can say, okay, how can I modify that so that it works better for me, so that I don't have these hot triggers grabbing hold of me easily, grabbing hard, and grabbing hold of them for a long time. So I'm going to avoid going into detail about these strategies because they're available elsewhere. You can get hold of those, and I'll put some links to some of James Grace's papers, or James Grace and others' papers about emotion regulation. The purpose of the podcast today was to get us thinking about the emotional sensitivity bit. Because if we can find the patterns, if we can find the meanings that we're making, if we can work out what's made those triggers hot, and I've given you 2 different ways or 2 different frames of looking at that, then that can be helpful for how we regulate those emotions if they occur at some point in the future. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. You'll have noticed that there's been some ample time to reflect, and I'd be delighted to hear your reflections if you wanted to share them either on Twitter. You can find me at Phil Wilcox. You can find me on LinkedIn in the same way, at Phil Wilcox. You can also find the Emotion at Work podcast on Instagram. You can let us know your thoughts on there, and you can come and join us in the Emotion at Work community, where you can share your thinking as well. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, and if you got this far, you must be interested in the role that emotions have in the workplace, either within individuals, between people in teams, or in organisations as a whole. So head over to the Emotion at Work hub, which you can find at community.emotionatwork.co.uk. Thanks for listening.